large, he came to personify the archetypal, single-minded Prussian bent upon war. To the German people, however, in his heyday, he was a hero, and worshipped by the soldiers too. On the other hand, powerful adversaries within the Wehrmacht regarded him as a threat to the sanctity of their caste, while to influential members of the Nazi hierarchy he represented much that was repugnant to them about army officers, even though at times he seemed closer to their way of thinking than most of the general staff. And of them all, nobody seemed more confused in his relationship with Guderian than Adolf Hitler himself. The recording of Guderian's activities has been warped by the prejudices that were generated by his impulsive and persuasive maverick spirit. Inevitably, the predispositions of Orthodox people were hostile to him, and jealousy was nursed by the casualties of a fierce internecine struggle that took place within a revolutionary German hierarchy. In the aftermath of an epoch of violence and hatred, what sort of convincing personal defense could be made by a general who had been kept behind bars, without trial, for 3 years? In the pages of Erinnerungen eines Soldaten, hereafter called by its English title of Panzer Leader, Guderian wrote what was, in effect, an account of the raising of the Panzertruppe interwoven with a defense of his activities in the years that followed. Since its publication, it has become a standard reference work in connection with the Panzertruppe and Guderian, though it is wide open to criticism, as all autobiographies must be. Apart from its omissions, it measures up well by standards of accuracy because the complete Guderian family archives were preserved. As a balanced description of the man, however, it is strangely deficient. Partly this is explained by the non-availability, at the time of composition, of official records from which he could refresh and widen his knowledge, and partly by the lack of other men's memoirs. But to some extent Guderian proved his own worst advocate in that he denied the reader insight into his background and a sight of the fundamental evidence which displayed the man in the making and in his true colours. He chose to reduce the story of his first 35 years to a mere couple of pages, and thus concealed the cause of so much that came to pass. The reasons for this are not entirely obscure. There seems to have been a certain presumption on his part of an unchallengeable integrity, a reasonable notion as it happens, but one that, at times, makes him sound almost too good to be true. Although family documents lend support to a strong case in his favour, he rarely bothered to produce them and, in explaining a few contentious matters, such as various accusations against him or the circumstances of certain intrigues, relapsed into oblique or even devious replies instead of giving blunt retorts such as were characteristic. Even to his tormentors he extended an almost exaggerated generosity that weakened his own case. However, it must be realized that Guderian assembled the memoirs under conditions of peculiar stress. Largely, the material was collected while he was a prisoner of the Americans, by whom he was interrogated in the search for evidence against both himself and his old comrades. The early days of his incarceration were spent in discomfort, sometimes in humiliating circumstances, and always in the expectation of indictment. Even when the Americans and British absolved him, the Poles endeavoured to bring him to trial in connection with the Battle for Warsaw in 1944. Later he became involved in a legal wrangle with Fabian von Schlabrendorff, whose book, Offiziere gegen Hitler, had appeared in Switzerland in 1946, and was, in 1948, to be serialized in a West German newspaper. Sections of that book were harmful to Guderian. They not only stimulated the distaste of those who already detested him, but drove Guderian to defend himself at law. Although Schlabrendorff was induced to recant publicly in 1948, the damage had been done. Schlabrendorff's first edition was quoted, and still is. Despite the appearance of a second edition in 1951, with all